In this week's video, we're going to be talking about resting membrane potential and action potentials. We're going to start with resting membrane potential. The resting membrane potential is the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane when the cell is not being stimulated. So when a cell is completely at rest, these are the charges that you will find within the cells. It's different for many cells throughout the body. For example, neurons, this potential is usually around -70, and in heart cells, it's usually around -90. There are a few things that work to establish RMP. The first one is going to be the establishment of ion gradients by the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump actively transports 3 sodiums out of the cell and 2 potassiums into the cell using ATP. This creates concentration gradients where sodium concentration is much higher outside of the cell and potassium concentration is much higher inside the cell. This pump is present in every body cell and functions to bring us to this resting membrane potential that allows our cells to function. The next thing that we're going to talk about is selective permeability and how it can affect RMP. Selective permeability is the cell membrane with its hydrophobic core acts as a barrier to hydrophilic substances such as ions. However, embedded within the membrane, there are certain protein channels that allow specific ions to cross through. Under regular conditions, there are more leak channels for potassium than there is for sodium. Once the concentration is made, there's a diffusion down the concentration gradients going from a high concentration to a low concentration. We also want to establish an electrical gradient. As positively charged ions leave the cell, they leave behind uncompensated negative charges within the cell, primarily from the negatively charged protons. It creates an electrical chemical gradient. With electrochemical equilibrium, the movement of K plus out of the cell continues to the electrical gradient, opposing its movement because it's equal to the magnitude of the chemical gradient driving it out. There are several conditions and factors that affect the magnitude or size of the resting membrane potential. There are changes in extracellular ion concentrations. So the concentration gradients of ions are a primary determinant of the RMP. For instance, something like hypokalemia, which is an elevated extracellular potassium concentration, reduces the potassium concentration gradient, causing less potassium to leave the cell, thus depolarizing the membrane potential, making it less negative. Conversely, hypokalemia, which is a lower than normal extracellular potassium concentration, increases the potassium concentration gradient, leading to more K plus leaving the cell and hyperpolarizing the membrane. There's changes in the membrane permeability to ions. The relative number of open ion channels for different ions significantly impacts RMP. The activity of the sodium-potassium pump, while the pump's primary role is establishing the concentration gradients, it contributes slightly to the negativity of intracellular movement just by moving 3 in and 2 out. When we're talking about the Nernst equation, it's a mathematical equation used to predict the equilibrium potential for a single ion across a membrane based on the concentration gradient of that ion. It is given by this formula: Ex is equal to -61.5 millivolts divided by Z, the log of the internal concentration to the outside concentration. The Nernst equation assumes that the membrane is permeable to only one ion. Therefore, it provides a theoretical potential that would exist if the membrane were exclusively permeable to that specific ion. It's useful for understanding individual ion gradients, but can't accurately predict the actual resting membrane potential for most cells. The driving force for an ion is the net force acting on that ion to move across the membrane. It is determined by the difference between the membrane potential, Vm, and the ion's equilibrium, E ion, which is calculated in the Nernst equation. The formula is driving force, dF, is equal to Vm minus E ion. The magnitude of the driving force indicates how strongly the ion will tend to move, and the sign indicates the direction of movement. A positive driving force for a positive ion means the movement out of the cell, if permeable, and negative driving force means movement into the cell. For example, at a typical RMP of -70, the equilibrium for the sodium is around +70. Therefore, the driving force is -140 millivolts, indicating a strong driving force for sodium to move into the cell. The equilibrium potential for potassium, on the other hand, is around 95. The driving force is -70, and so on. You get a 25 plus millivolts. Moving on to action potentials. There's action potential as a rapid, transient depolarization and repolarization of the cell membrane that can propagate along membrane of excitable cells like neurons and muscle cells. It is the fundamental mechanism for long-distance communication within the nervous system, and for other things. Characteristics of an action potential. The first thing is that it is an all-or-nothing response. You're either going to get an action potential or you're not. The next thing is thresholds. Depolarization, or the moving positively inside the cell, must reach a specific threshold point to trigger an action potential. If it doesn't reach threshold, nothing is going to happen. The next thing is propagation. So once it's initiated an action potential, it can propagate down the entire length of the axon without decreasing in amplitude, which happens due to other things that we're going to talk about later. The last thing that we're going to talk about in this section is for refractory periods. So after an action potential happens, there's a brief period when the membrane is less excitable or completely unexcitable due to further stimulation because of certain channels being open or closed. All right, there are certain order of events that happen during a typical action potential. The first one that we're going to talk about is the resting state. The membrane is at the resting membrane potential with a voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels closed. There's obviously still your potassium leak channels are open. That's what's helping us maintain our resting membrane potential. The second thing that's going to happen is a stimulus and depolarization to threshold. So a local stimulus causes a graded potential that's going to depolarize the membrane. If this depolarization reaches the threshold potential, it will then trigger the opening of certain channels. The rising phase, or the depolarization, the steep uphill climb, is once threshold is reached, voltage-gated sodium channels will open rapidly. The driving force for sodium is large and ints towards the cell, so sodium ions rush into the cell, causing that rapid depolarization of the membrane potential, making the inside of the cell become positive. The next is the falling phase, or phase 4, part 4, which is the repolarization. At the peak of the action potential, two key events contribute to the repolarization. First is the inactivation of the voltage-gated sodium channels. The inactivation gates of the voltage-gated sodium channels close, blocking further sodium coming into the cell. This inactivation is time-dependent and occurs with a slight delay after the activation gates open. The next thing that happens up there is the opening of the voltage-gated sodium channels. Potassium channels. The voltage-gated potassium channels open in response to depolarization, but with a slower time course than the sodium channels do. The efflux of positively charged potassium channels is out of the cell, driven by both the concentration gradients and now the positive intracellular environment. As this happens, the membrane is going to be repolarized. Step 5 is after the repolarization. We're going to go to what we call hyperpolarization, or an undershoot. This is when your voltage-gated potassium channels remain open for a brief period, even after the membrane potential has returned to the resting level. During this time, and the increased potassium permeability drives the membrane potential closer to the equilibrium potential for potassium, resulting in a transient hyperpolarization, making the membrane potential more negative than the resting potential. The last thing is returning to the resting membrane. When we talk about refractory periods, the first type of refractory period we have is absolute refractory period. This period occurs during the rising phase and the first part of the falling phase of an action potential. During this time, voltage-gated sodium channels are either already open or are inactivated. Inactivated sodium channels cannot be reopened by any stimulus, no matter how strong. Therefore, another action potential cannot be generated during the absolute refractory period. The next refractory period is the relative one. This period follows the absolute refractory period and occurs during the after and the hyperpolarization. Most sodium channels have returned to their resting, closed but capable of opening state. However, the membrane is still hyperpolarized due to the continued opening of some voltage-gated potassium channels. A stronger than normal stimulus would be required to overcome that. The next thing we have to talk about is capacitance. Capacitance is the ability of a system to store electrical charge for a given electrical potential difference. Mathematically, it can be defined as C equals Q divided by V. The cell membrane acts as a capacitor because it has two conductive surfaces, separated by a non-conductive layer. The hydrophilic heads of the phospholipids attract charges, while the hydrophilic tails act as an insulator. A membrane with a high capacitance can store a large amount of charge at a given voltage. Capacitance is also directly proportional to the permittivity of the membrane. Now we're going to move on to length constant. Length constant, also known as space constant, is measured of how far a change in membrane potential can spread passively along an axon or a dendrite. It represents the distance at which a change in the membrane potential has decreased to approximately a certain percentage of its original value. The length constant is determined by relationship between the membrane resistance and internal resistance of the cytoplasm. Mathematically, it can be defined as length constant is equal to the square root of Rm divided by Ri. A larger length constant indicates that the change in potential can spread further before dissipating. Membrane resistance is the resistance to ion flow across the membrane, while internal resistance is the resistance to flow current along the cytoplasm. There are a lot of things that can affect and change your capacitance and length constant. We're going to talk about a very specific one in the next couple minutes here. There are a lot of things that, if we go back to capacitance for a minute, capacitance does have a lot to do with permittivity, and there's a formula for that. It has to do with the surface area and the distance between charges. To talk about the effects of myelin on our capacitance, myelin is an insulating sheath formed by glial cells. So it's either Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system or oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. They wrap around axons. Myelination significantly affects the electrical properties of an axon. How it affects capacitance? Myelin decreases the capacitance of axonal membrane. This occurs because myelin, it increases the distance between the intracellular and extracellular charges due to the thickness of the myelin sheath. It has fewer polar molecules. It's a lipid layer, so compared to the bare membrane, it has fewer polar molecules, decreasing permittivity. A lower capacitance means that less charge needs to be moved across the membrane to produce change in membrane potential, leading to a faster depolarization and repolarization. Now, how does myelin affect length constant? Myelin increases the length constant of the axon. This is primarily, it's due to a few things, but primarily to increased membrane resistance. So myelin acts as an insulator, reducing the leakage of ions across the membrane, and only allows them to leak between the myelin sheaths at the nodes of Ranvier, which is significantly increasing our Rm. We're also significantly decreasing our Ri. Myelin is typically found in the larger diameter axons, and a larger diameter automatically reduces the internal resistance. So current flow in the cytoplasm, the increase of the Rm and the decrease of the Ri both contribute to a larger length constant. Allowing the depolarization current to spread farther along the myelinated segments compared to an unmyelinated segment. They are allowed to jump between them, potentially jump from one node to another node, which is called saltatory conduction, which dramatically increases the speed of action potential propagation. That was our video on resting membrane potentials and action potentials. I hope that covered everything, but the end.